Hi, Maria.
Hey, there's Maria.
Indeed.
Hello. I got an email. Yeah, how's your summer?
Hot.
George.
Indeed.
Hello.
Welcome. How are you, George?
I'm okay. I'm fine. I'm good. My first granddaughter is supposed to be born this Friday.
Wow, exciting.
I think I'm way more nervous than her parents.
Welcome, everybody. Today's Access User Group lunchtime webinar is the first of the fall session. So welcome back after a couple-month summer break. We are going to talk today about using SQL Server with Access. And I do want to give just a little bit of a shout out here. We have the accessusergroups.org. In that, you can become members of several different groups. These are all the different groups that you can become members of. Notice that we have a fairly new Europe chapter. They are giving their webinars about the same time frame, but I believe it's the first Wednesday of each month. For people in at least Western Europe, it's their evening, so that's a good time for them. There's also a very active Pacific group. I believe we have George here who runs that. That's in the evening Pacific time. So for some of us, it's really late, and for others, it's the middle of the night, but I think they get some Australians there.
Yeah, a couple of regulars from Australia. And
Yeah. So there's a couple of Spanish-speaking groups. I believe that we're going to lose our Eastern group, which was kind of a breakfast group on Eastern time. And then this happens to be the SQL Server with Access group that I have showing because I want to highlight this since our topic is SQL Server with Access. It's done by the founder of accessusergroups.org, which is Juan Soto. And I think he does it in the evenings, and I forget what days those are. But if you become a member on accessusergroups.org and you add the group, you can do more than one group. You can get on their mailing list and you'll get notices about it. So I wanted to point that out.
Can I ask a question?
Yes.
Hi, I'm new. I just joined. Yay.
Welcome.
I'm super excited because I am just, you're my people. So is it possible to get a copy of this? You're recording it right now. So is there a place where the copies of the presentations are stored?
Yes. So the recordings themselves are done through WebEx, and then it does take a couple weeks, but then we will post that on YouTube. We also have a YouTube channel. Let me see.
That's good to know. I think I signed the lunchtime one because that was the only one that seemed logical for me to start off with. But
Yep. But on the YouTube, we each have a playlist on here. Let me see. You can subscribe to accessusergroups.org, and then there are playlists for each.
Signing off is all right.
There's playlists.
I can't believe how fast their ugly yellow toenail fungus disappeared.
Nice one.
Oh my. Okay, let's see if we can shut that up here. And yeah, it could be worse. There are ads, unfortunately. Oh, now I can see the chat thing.
I was going to say a couple of things, Maria, if I may very briefly interrupt. Oh, someone has just done, well done, Crystal. That was one of the things, was to send a message, and then everyone should see something pop up, so they'll find out how to see chat. The second thing was, you mentioned WebEx. I think you mean on Zoom in this case. On this
Zoom,
occasion.
I'm sorry, not WebEx, Zoom. And it does start recording at the beginning. And also another shout out, Crystal, who posted the link to the lunchtime playlist. She does the editing for me for these videos. She doesn't do all the chapters. Some of the chapter presidents do their own, but she's been kind enough so far to help me do the editing because she's an expert at that and I am not. So without further ado, and do feel free to Introduce yourself in the chat, especially if you're new. If you are not talking and asking a specific question, if you would go ahead and mute yourself just so we don't get so much background noise for the video. Thank you. A little bit about different types of SQL usage methods. First of all, I want to just briefly discuss two types above the line here that we are not going to talk about today, but they are definitely ways to connect to SQL. So I thought they were at least worth a mention in this discussion. The first is Access Data Projects. They also are called ADPs, and that was a very different way of connecting to SQL where the tables themselves, the queries were all really in SQL, and the way that the Access Data Project was set up allowed information to be recorded and kept so that you could access those directly. But that was deprecated with Access 2013, so we're not going to discuss it. You may still have some out there, and they can still be used if you're using it with older versions of Access. Also, Access Web Apps was a SQL method because the actual data for the setup and the data itself for the web apps was all stored in SQL Azure. So that was technically a SQL usage. But that, although it was introduced maybe in 2010, I think, they deprecated it in 2018. So unless you are running your own server, a SharePoint server with those on it, and even though those are getting fewer and further between as people upgrade to different versions of SharePoint, so we're not going to discuss that either. So we're going to start today with linked tables, which is the most common usage of linking up access to SQL. Before we get into the actual demonstration here in the application, just a couple notes. If you are moving data from Access into SQL Server and then going to create link tables to them, I highly suggest you use the SSMA, which is the SQL Server Migration Assistant, to help you. It does a couple things in its migration. It adds row versions to your tables, which help with synchronization, and it also does things like sets bit default values to 0, because in SQL, we're dealing with bits being 0 or 1, 0 for false, 1 for true. And in Access, it's -1 for a true value. So SQL Server Migration Assistant is helpful. It is a little tricky sometimes to install, although my opinion is it's getting a little easier. If you have a 32-bit machine, you actually have to use SQL Server Migration Assistant 32. Otherwise, you should try to match the bitness to the version of Office you have. And then in some instances, especially if you have Microsoft 365, you might have to install a database engine to see the tables in SQL Server Migration Assistant. If you need something that's a different bitness than your Office version, then you have to install a different version, like Access 2013 if you're on 365. So just a few hints about that. And if you've already got data in SQL, then you don't need SQL Server Migration Assistant to migrate it. You can link it directly. This is the interface that you get when you go to external data and you try to create a link, or even if you're trying to import from SQL Server. Notice that there's a couple different kinds of connector options here. In the example that I have here today, I'm using integrated Windows authentication. So there's no password to pass or anything like that. But there are other options, and the options depend a little bit on what version of SQL Server you're connecting to, because not all of them, the older versions might not support all of these. I believe that in this case, I'm using a DSN connection that's SQL Server 17. We'll verify that as we look at it here. So it does have some more possibilities here for Azure, etc. But you can use Active Directory integrated authentication instead of Windows authentication. You can use SQL Server authentication with a login ID and password. And then here's a couple other newer ones that you could use. Okay, so let's get to the app here.
Very brief interruption, if I may, Maria.
Yep.
First of all, George put in an update to what older versions could do. It's in the chat. I won't read it back out, about when AWAs came in and what they did, etc. That's well worth reading. The other thing I wanted to, if you have a second, I wanted to explain to people why SQL Server uses a 1 and a 0 and Access uses a -1 and a 0. And the reason is SQL Server has a bit field. They use bit fields, which Access doesn't. Access only sees, it stores its booleans in an integer field. So to get as close to that as possible, basically 1 means true and 0 means false. But when you've got to spread that across a whole variable, an integer variable, if every single bit position is a 1, the result you get in numeric terms is -1. And that is why in Access we see the true being -1 and 0, obviously all zeros is 0. But that's why we have the difference between Access and SQL Server. SQL Server is a more true bit field, but Access can't do that, so it does the best it can. So thank you.
Yep, good note. And, some developers prefer, if they're doing a migration, to actually use an integer field in SQL Server so that the comparisons are more alike. But of course, an integer field does take more space than a bit field does. So yeah, good explanation. Very thorough. Thank you. So these tables are linked. In order to create the link to them, I used the External Data tab and New Data Source from Database from SQL Server. So that's where you saw that the pop-up on the slide back here below was through that interface. And I actually created a DSN doing that. It doesn't store the DSN name here. It stores the DSN information. But if you hover over the table, you can see the connection. So it's the ODBC driver 17 for SQL Server that I'm using in this example. And like I said, I think they have a 19 now, but I haven't been using that as practice yet. So you can also see this if you go to Design View. It's going to tell you that you can't modify it because it's a linked table, but you can see this same description here or the same link here on this description. And notice it links to the table as well. So please remember, if you don't have a question, go ahead and mute if you would, because I hear a little bit of background noise. What the DSN file looks like. Okay, sure. I probably can get to that just by going back into here. So here again is the interface. So you could import a brand new table from SQL. I'm going to choose the link. And then here's where you get the DSN connection. I've already saved it. I've saved it in this file right here. But if I choose that, I think, oh, no.
Another quick interruption, Maria, while you're concentrating. You really don't want to be disturbed. Audrey's asked, will you be covering SSMA at all?
No, I really will not today.
Thank you.
So I am going to leave you with a couple different resources, including a link to the SQL Server with Access group that I mentioned. They are actually doing a 3-part fall series, kind of a basic of SQL Server. And I believe in the first session, which is coming up here in a couple weeks, they will cover that. So I'm not going to cover SSMA today.
Oh, that's good.
Yeah, so I think maybe if I do new is the best. So when you create a new one, you get connectors here, and you can choose your ODBC connection, and then you can name it, and then you get information. You can set your server, and then I think in the next, it will give you these options we talked about. You can do things like change the default database. So that's the setup process to set up a DSN. You can also do this through the ODBC interface if you just go to your Windows and you type ODBC, but you can do it directly through the get external data interface as well.
Maria, by
yeah.
my comment, I meant, can you open it with Notepad so people can see, hey, it's really something simple that you can create, and it lets you just really get in quick.
You're talking about like this? Like open this in Notepad?
No. What Crystal's talking
The DSN file. Yeah, the DSN file, the text file.
Where are they at? Do you remember?
I don't know where yours are, but I have everything on my computer. So, if I'm looking for something and everything, if I'm looking for the DSN files, I just do DSN. Do you want me to just put a sample DSN in the chat?
Sure, that might be handier, and then I can go on, okay? When you look at them, it's basically like a little config file, and they contain this information. In these linked tables, then, I could look at these from SQL Server, or I could look at them here. You can add things directly to them, whatever you want here. And then if you go like to SQL Server, I have SSMA or SSMS, pulled up. You can see then that you have those same rows here in SQL, and if you add one in here, if you refresh your Access database, then you can see those in, there's an easy refresh all. Then you can see it in Access. So this is directly linked. This data is in SQL. So this is one of the most common ways to do is linked tables. And notice that this from SSMA has a timestamp file, which helps to keep track of row versions and whether or not, you've got any kind of someone else editing something at the same time as you were trying to do so. All right, so you can also use SQL Datasets, and that allows you to use something called a DSNLess connection. So I want to talk a little bit about that. There's a couple pieces of that. The first is your connection, and you do need to be aware of the fact that when accessed generically through the ODBC drivers, connects to SQL Server, it can open multiple connections. So sometimes people try to do things and they happen to be on two different connections and things seem out of whack to them. But that can be why, is because they have a couple different connections. And it's really actually hard, or not hard, but you have to explicitly control your connection in order to get more of a one connection per access type of scenario. So I like to do this by having a ADODB connection object that's in a module, so it's accessible publicly. And then in whatever form that you open when you start up the application, I make a call in the form open event to a store procedure like this that opens up that connection. And then that connection, for the most part, stays open. And so then it can be reused with different routines. In this case, this string here, which is a connection string, is basically the same string as you would see in that description for the table, except for it doesn't have the ODBC colon in front of it. It also doesn't have the particular table because we're just connecting to the database in this case. But that's my connection string, and I use it to open the connection, and then that's stored in this string C. And you might ask, no, option explicit. I'm sorry. I did this in a hurry. You are right. So, yeah, you might ask why I have variables that look like we're back in ancient computer times where you had to be careful and not make your variables be very long or have good explanations in the names. And I actually do it on purpose in this case because we are talking about a connection to SQL and a connection string. That just helps protect my code from people that might be trying to read memory on my machine or something like that and get that connection string. It's a way of I forget how to pronounce it, making somebody not look at this. If they saw string D in memory, they probably wouldn't think, oh, that's a connection string. Let me go look at that closer. So
obfuscate.
Obfuscate. Okay, there we go. I just couldn't say the word. Thank you. Anyway, so that's what I usually do is do that. And I'm going to go ahead and run the actual code here. That's the form that gets called on open for this database is this one, inventory transactions list. And that indeed then calls this OpenC to open the SQL connection in the form open event. So you can do a couple things. You could have a form be connected directly to a linked table. And that's one of the simpler things to do. So this is an example of one with transaction types, and the data source for this is the transaction types table, which is a linked table here. So when I run this form, this is going directly to SQL through that linked table. And that's a good way to do it, but I have some applications where I want the SQL database to be more protected. I don't want direct links in my Access database and people to be able to possibly, directly edit those if they're not using the forms and that kind of thing. So for those kind of approaches, I prefer to use a data set. So in this case, this is just a copy of this without that. Notice that the record source is blank. So what I do in this case is on the open event of that, I make a call to a routine I developed called ADO form, and I pass it the form itself, and then I pass it a select statement. And this select statement is going to be executed in SQL itself. So if we go over here to the definition, it's in this, sorry about that. It's in this same function here. It's pretty simple, and I've got it commented a little bit. It's just going to fill the form with data. Okay, so it creates a new record set. It sets the connection, to the SQL connection, which is this function here, which basically looks at this connection variable, sees whether it's open. If not, it opens it and it returns the connection itself. I could have, instead of doing that, I could have called this string directly, but I found that having an interrupting or intermediary function is a little safer. Sometimes if you've got a connection open to SQL, you can maybe lose internet for a minute or something like that, and then your connection gets closed. And so it's safer before you make a call to it to make sure that the connection is open and reopen it if it needs to be. Then I also set a couple fields in the record set, a cursor type, a cursor location, a lock type, and then I do an open call using the string that's passed in. And then I set the form record set equal to that record set, close the record set in this function, and then set that to nothing. So sometimes I find that I have to reopen the record set in the form itself, but most of the time you don't. Even if you're going to edit, it still will do so with a closed record set. So anyway, that's all there is to that type of call. So just for clarity, if you've got a record set object and you could do different types of things with it. You can do a select statement on a table. You can do a select statement on a SQL query, or you can actually call stored procedures with parameters that are inline. So I think I have examples of that here. So this transaction types, you could, if there was some type of query in here, you could use that instead of this table name here. And it would be the same syntax. You could add a where or whatever. And again, that SQL statement, whatever it is, would be run server side. And then you would get results passed back to your application. Yeah, Crystal, as far as calling a stored procedure, this is one way to do it. I'm also going to demo another way in a few minutes here, but you can use this ADO form and you can call a stored procedure like this. This is the stored procedure, and you do need the schema name because this is SQL. And then in this case, I have a parameter 1. It happens to mean maybe active, only show me active transaction types or something like that. But then if you had a stored procedure in SQL that did essentially select star from transaction types and had maybe a parameter it used and it added a where clause according to whether it was active or not. This transaction type table doesn't really have an active indicator, but this is just an example. So that's one way of doing it. And again, I'm going to talk a little bit about another way to call stored procedures here after we talk about queries and pass-through queries just a little bit more, because sometimes they get more complicated than you can do on one line like this. So just another note here for linked tables. If you are using access form record sets, instead of setting the record set directly on the form to a linked table, for instance, if you're doing something like the below, where you get a record set, you set the SQL, you open the record set, and then maybe you set that to the form record set. There are definitely styles of programming I've seen that use some techniques like this. There's nothing wrong with that at all. But if you do so and you want to be able to add records and see the identity field in SQL, you actually need to add this indicator, this dbSeeChanges. That indicator will allow or have the call to open record set return the indicator of the actual ID. Otherwise, I see people doing things like making another call to get the last updated ID and that kind of stuff. You shouldn't need to do that if you use this dbSeeChanges. Crystal asks a question about whether using dbSeeChanges has adverse effects if the tables are in Access. Well, that's a really good question. I have not tried that. I generally don't see that. Do you know the answer to that? Does anyone know the answer to that?
It doesn't have any problems.
Okay.
I've had mixed things.
Yeah, so you might want to start doing that. I have had several applications that I've upgraded to SQL Server, and it is a bit of a pain to like find all the locations of open Recordset and add that where you need it. And so, yeah, you might just get in the habit of adding that, even if you're coding in Access only, so you can plan for the future. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about queries. First of all, I want to warn you that if you have linked tables in an Access application, like this, where we've got linked tables, and then you have queries written in Access that use those tables, you need to be a little careful because they might not be doing exactly what you thought of. So let's take this one as an example. I'm going to actually pull this into SQL View so we can see it a little better. But we've got, oh, this one just orders and combines. So that's maybe not a good one. Here, let's take this one. Okay, this one has a filter. Okay, so it's filtering here. It's selecting inventory where inventory discontinued equals false. If you run this as an Access query against a linked table, which is inventory, then what happens is Access goes to SQL and it pulls back the entire inventory table. And then in memory, in Access, it applies this filter.
Maria,
so, yeah.
So I've got an important interruption here from young George. Is there any possibility of pumping up the font size?
Oh,
there are some of us that struggle to.
Yeah. All right, remind me how to do that.
I'm going to let George jump in and explain if he can.
Try under File, Options, I guess it is, Object Designers. And I believe right there it is. That I appreciate that a great deal.
So must
dear.
close and reopen.
Yeah, sorry.
No problem.
Thank you so very much.
No, thanks. I should have thought of that beforehand. Sorry about that. Okay, let's try this again. See if it's a little bigger. Okay, better? All right. Okay.
Yes,
so,
thank you.
Yes. I must add to this the caveat that in some cases, I am not an expert on the providers, but some of the data providers handle some of these clauses a little more friendly than others. But I'm just warning you that you could see some serious degradation in running Access queries through linked tables because of the fact that in many cases, it will do things like pull all the data back from SQL instead of the filtered set. So one of the ways to get around this is by using something called pass-through queries. And you can do pass-through queries in a couple ways. The most straightforward way is to do it through the Access interface. So for something like that, you might take, actually this is probably a good example, sorry. Query like this. And then in the Query Design tab, there's a pass-through option. So what the pass-through does is it gives you in here a ODBC connection string. And then you can take your connection string from one of your linked tables, for example, and copy that over. You don't need the table employees part of it. but you could copy like this and then put that here in this connection. And that then runs this SQL on the server and then brings back the results. So let's try it here. And so I did a brand new one. Here it is. Notice that it has a little world indicator to indicate that it's linked, just like the others do. Okay, whoops, it gives me an error. Invalid column name, false. Okay, so let's take a look at it. You have to remember when you do this that this now has to be in SQL syntax, not Access SQL syntax, which is a little bit different. So we have available to us in the Access user groups here under, whoops, nope, this is the YouTube, sorry, let's go back to this. Under the Access user groups .org website, there's a SQL Converter option, and I have it open here. So you can put in here on this side your Access SQL, and then you can run a convert, and it will give you the updated SQL and what it should be in SQL. So the real difference here is that instead of false, it has a 0 here. So we're going to do that in Access. We're going to change the false to 0. And you can use that SQL Converter not just for linked queries, but you could use it for select statements that you write in code, for example, or that kind of thing as well. Okay, so here we go. And this is being run directly on the server, and then only the results sent back here, as opposed to everything coming back to Access. And I think I did find actually an error earlier today in this converter, so I'll send that, leave feedback, and they'll check into that. They're continually trying to improve this. So,
Maria, can I interject with a couple of very small points? One of the very quick one is if you'd written that as where not inventory discontinued instead of where that equals false, which is I know what Access gives you, but if you were to do that, then you wouldn't have had an issue converting because it's more portable.
That's a good point. Yep.
And the other one
is there a good resource that you have for writing portable code at all?
My brain.
Your brain. That would make a good topic. Maybe we can have that be a topic.
Just from many years of picking things up in Access and other languages as well before.
Yep.
The other thing I wanted to bring to your attention, and you may already know already, but you illustrated a pass-through query.
Yep.
Okay. What you can also do is have an ordinary non-pass-through query that refers to a table in a remote database. And that remote database can not only be other Access databases, but other ODBC databases. So if you were using all queries instead of your tables, you could lose those tables, as I've done in one of my databases, because I was told one of the tables that I was linking to was very sensitive. So instead of having that table in the database at all, I had a query which got the information I wanted from that table, and within that I could specify from that table, you could say in and then follow it with the details for the remote database.
I'm not sure I'm following you. So was your query a pass-through query?
No, it was an Access query.
Okay.
Within a query, if you look at the help system, I'm lucky enough to still have access to a 2003 help system, which worked really well, seamlessly and lovely. But if you go into the Jet SQL, there's two prongs. One is data definition and one is data manipulation. So the data manipulation one of the properties for a table, if you say, I want to select star from and table, if you then say that table in and then database.
Oh, yes. Okay.
Parameter.
So can we create a query like that?
Sure. I say that. I have to generally look it up, and I do it very rarely, but I can.
Yeah. So like you're talking about if you do like select star from, and instead of doing employees here, if you have like the server name in here or something like that.
Yep. You'd say, no, and not then, in. You'd say from table and then in. I think the parameter is in. Let me go and have a quick.
I just put the syntax in the chat.
Ah, well done.
Okay, here we go. Let me copy this over here
so we can
see it. So this is a good point. And obviously, my list is not exhaustive. What I'm showing you today is techniques that I use, and they're fairly common techniques, but other people may have some other techniques they use. So I would like today to be interactive. So if you have some techniques you're using like this, I think that's great.
You brought up earlier, Maria, the idea of obfuscating the table. And this is one of the things I use. I don't use it exclusively with Access. I use it with ODBC as well. Okay. And that means I've got basically a SQL Server database in the background, and that is, I don't have any linked tables to that SQL Server, even though I'm using linked data. So anyone looking at my thing can't do what you were talking about earlier and just go straight to the linked tables.
So would you put the connection string right here?
Let me dig it up for you.
Okay.
It's similar to
all right.
use in, but you carry on with other things. I'll be digging that up.
My question, Adrian, doesn't that expose the password and login if you're using SQL authentication in the query?
Yeah, it would if you were using SQL authentication.
Yeah. It's
actually quite difficult if you're using SQL authentication to have a password that's not a login and a password that's not something that someone could find. It's best to use Active Directory, honestly, in a larger organization to connect to SQL and to authenticate it. And then you're using the user's login against that. That's my preference and what I would recommend if you're concerned about security and passwords. So I do have some places where I make use of like application level logins and passwords, but for smaller companies, but they're just not as concerned about that. And most of those places, they're using SQL Azure, and there are other ways of keeping those. You can set your Azure database so that only certain IP addresses have access to them, and then that becomes a higher level of protection as well. So, okay, let's move on here.
Quickly to update what I said earlier, I find that it doesn't allow me to access remote databases and the local at the same time. It's very much like your pass-through query. It's not quite a pass-through query because it is Access SQL, Jet SQL, but it's similar. I have put the in my example in one in the chat.
Okay, so it does look like it has the ODBC connection in there then in the in. Yep. Okay. Sounds good. I had heard about that, but I had forgotten about that. And it's not something I use, but like I said, there are obviously different techniques that work. So it's great to include it. Okay. So besides doing that, let's see, I have query here. Oh, I guess I have it open. Okay, so here is an example of actually, instead of using a pass-through query that I've already set up, I'm setting up the pass-through query here. So I have on the form open event, I have, and usually I wouldn't do this in every form open because you'd end up with repetitive queries. You'd have to like make sure it's not there and delete it. But I put this here for purposes of illustration. So I would often run this kind of code to set up the query to begin with the first time I was setting it up. And I just find in some cases this is easier than copying and pasting and doing it through the Access interface. So this sets up a SQL statement. It sets up the connection portion of the query def. It gives the query a name. Here's the SQL statement setup, and then it sets the SQL property of the query def to that SQL statement, and then it adds the query through this. And then you can set your record source equal to that query like this. So yeah, you could certainly do a temporary pass-through in a way like this, and then maybe on your form close, you would delete it or something like that. Or if you had some kind of process that you were using on a semi-repetitive basis and you didn't want that to hang out. So yes, a good point, Crystal. Notice that I'm using the form open event. It's one of the first events that gets fired when you open a form, so it's a good place to set things like that. Form load is actually talking about what happens when you're actually loading up the record source. So you would definitely want to make sure to do it before form load. All right, so let's see, what else do we have here? Okay, there's a converter. Okay, and then, yeah, you can use queries just like the tables, SQL-based queries in setting a data set and calling the routine. And then I want to talk a little bit about stored procedures. We already saw how you could use a stored procedure just on like a one command line with the data set directly. You can also use the SQL Command object for stored procedures. And I have an example of that in this code here. And I can publish this code as examples, but I'll probably remove the actual server or make it be a dummy server in that. And so therefore, I'll maybe make a local copy so that you could export tables to your own SQL server to actually run this stuff. So be forewarned about that when you're looking for the code later. So this procedure calls a store procedure, and I use the command object to do that, the ADODB command object. And here I've just got dummy characters here. I don't have the actual connection string, but like if I had my SQL connection here, I would set it to this instead of the generic connection string. You would have your stored procedure name be in the CommandText line, and then you can create one or more parameters. This is parameter 1. But if you are going to use a return value from your stored procedure, if it returns like a possible error value or something like that, then that has to be first, and it has to be called return_value. It's a type integer. There are other types of parameters you can use. You could do a bit, and these AD predefined types are in there. And then this is the length here of it, and depending upon the type you use, there are different lengths. An integer is 4. If you would do like add varchar, you might have a bigger field like 100 or whatever. And then this here is the value that you're passing. So a lot of people get this from their code. They do me dot whatever the field name was and be passing values from their code in there. And again, this is a public sub. You probably wouldn't have it as a public sub. You would probably put the particular store procedure code in the particular form you were going to use it for and make a call there. Okay, could you pass values for active connection and CommandText to the call? You certainly could. The active connection in this case, we're keeping as a global variable. So you might just use that, so we have this, use that directly rather than passing it, but you could certainly do those things. You have to be a little careful, Aid, because The parameters is probably something that's specific to what store procedure you're calling. But if, you could use something similar to this or develop something similar to this where you passed in what you needed. Maybe you could pass the parameters in as like a comma separated list and then split things back out. I'm sure you could do a lot with this if you wanted to do this. So anyway, we're about at the end here. We've got about 6 more minutes left. So I will open it up here to questions. And I want to also leave you with these resources. FMS Inc. has a couple of good articles on migrating access to SQL Server, upsizing databases to SQL Server. This is the link I was talking about here. Woo! This one here to the SQL Server with Access Academy. That's the one that is coming up here. Let's take a look. September 13th. And again, it's a 3-part series. Juan usually repeats this academy each fall in the first 3 sessions. So that's a good follow-up webinar if you're interested in this topic to our series of webinars. Here's also a link to the most recent version of SQL Server Migration Assistant and a link to the SQL Converter. Questions, anyone? Please unmute yourself if you're muted. Feel free to ask or type in the chat if you're shy.
Hey, Maria, I apologize. I came late to the party. It is recorded, so will we be able to review it after it's finished?
Yep. I don't typically publish the direct link to the recording right after, but within a little while, Crystal, I don't know if you have a time commitment or how things are going, but Crystal will publish it to YouTube, to our YouTube channel.
I generally wait. Then this one still goes up before the next meeting.
Yeah, so sometime before the next meeting, definitely, the recording will be up.
Okay, and sorry, I have another question. And I'm sorry if you had covered it. I work for a company. My name's Stephen Lecomte, and I work for Benefit Architects, and they use primarily Access databases here, and they're kind of shy away from SQL Server, so we do have a few tables that are so large you can't put it in Access. So I've been encouraged them try to move that data there, and the tables that are being accessed with Access as a front end use pass-through queries, and that's been so helpful. They are building advanced access queries, and what I try to do is just build a pass-through query for each table, and then they can go from there and modify their needs in that manner. It's been going really well. And recently, the glitch that was coming up was like a type mismatch. And I got with Dale Fye. I'm sure you know him. He recommended using the ODBC SQL Server 17. And after that, we didn't have any issues because some of the tables had the newer date field. So once we moved to that helped tremendously. So everything's been going great with pass-through queries. I haven't had any issues. I'm trying to go away from linked tables and try to move all to the pass-through queries. Is there anything wrong with that? Should I use DSNLess? Should I use the link? Should I try these? I'm really comfortable. I think pass-through queries is the best for that scenario. What do you think?
Well, if you're talking about inside of one company and they don't mind an access, the issue with an access database is you can take that database, it's a physical file, and you can email it to somebody, depending upon whatever security you've got. You have to have right access in order to even open it and run it, right? So if you're concerned about that link and those linked queries being exposed in that database, then you might want to find a different way to do it in a little more obscure way. But if it's not something that concerns this company because they're, confident of their users and you're fine with them having access to the data that they do have access and it's working for you, it's a fine way of operating.
The only thing I can think of is that pass-through queries are read-only. Is that an issue? It must not be an issue.
Or what?
Are they?
They're not read-only. No, I'm doing updating data, pulling data, updating SQL. The other limitation I've found with pass-through queries is when you use them in a subform, sometimes it won't allow you to join up with the access data, another access query. So
other thing you need to be careful with, depending upon how you're setting up your subforms, is when you open a form with the subform can actually fill with data first if you have a bound subform.
Yeah.
So if you are relying on a filter from the parent form, sometimes those fail. I typically use what's called an unbound subform, and then as part of the form open event or maybe it's a form load event of the parent form, that's when I bind the subforms. And that way you get the latency or the order that you would expect for those.
Yeah, it's good thinking. Yeah. That's a good way to do it.
Good point to bring up.
Yes, indeed.
Yeah, I don't know if you've had past meetings describing or displaying that, but that would be something I'd like to see. And another suggestion would be, let's say you had personal data to encrypt. Is there a way in Access and SQL to show things like maybe encrypting like dummy socials or doing the, what do they call it when they put the asterisks over it? And then show that as a demo of how you can safeguard information, what's showing through Access, what's showing through SQL. They even do like a Wireshark thing that's showing the data being sent and then showing it encrypted and see if there's a way to test it. That would be really cool.
So I do know someone who's really great at encryption. He's from overseas, and so I'm not sure if he'd be willing to talk for us, but I will ask him about it. But as far as the late binding, you might take a look back through the Access Lunchtime YouTube playlist.
Okay.
Crystal and I did I think it was a 4-part series on some of the basics of Access for beginning developers. And I'm guessing it was the 3rd in that series, talked about forms and had a discussion about late binding. Not that we couldn't cover it again in another topic, but you might take a look for that video. And
it's basically just changing the record source, right? It's having it blank when it comes up.
It's not having it hard-coded into the form and setting it via code. Yes, that's exactly what it is.
Okay.
And I also use that in particular for something where you would have like a main form and tabs on the bottom.
Right.
And there's maybe a different subform on each tab. Well, if you don't go to one of those tabs, you don't need to load that data. And you can speed up your application considerably by only loading the tab that shows on open. And then if they click the tab that they need, then go ahead and load that too, so.
I wanted to ask, I'm sorry to dominate the discussion, but I did want to answer George's question on whether a pass-through query is pass-through or not. There's a property there that says when you say don't show records, once you turn that off, then that allows update, insert, all those type of queries to go through, just FYI.
So here, oops.
Sorry. Thank you for answering my questions. I appreciate these events like this.
Maybe on descriptions here, property sheet.
Properties.
One of these you're talking about?
Yeah, I'm trying to get to one.
Returns records, yes?
Yes, you turn that off, you turn that no, and then you put your updatable code. You say tell no, and then you put your update, insert whatever actionable query you want, and that'll allow you to write.
I think you're getting a bit confused there, Stephen.
That doesn't sound familiar to me.
No, let me explain what I think you're doing. Mm-hmm. What you're talking about there is not about whether it's an updatable query, but whether it's an action query.
Correct.
And one of the action queries is update. So
now I get it.
If you want to change that to an action query, then you have to change that. But that's not quite what George was asking about, I don't believe.
Gotcha. Okay. Sorry.
Now I get what you're doing. You're sending an action query back to the SQL Server to update. Yeah.
Correct.
Okay. Yeah, I'm talking about the record set that's returned by a select.
Gotcha. Okay.
So are you having trouble making your select queries updatable, George?
In 20 some years, I've never been able to do it.
I have that issue as well. Just FYI. I was in the same boat. I had basically when you log tables. And so in order for me to make it writable, I had to use a link table versus a pass-through query. So once I had that link table and I had the permissions to write whatever user I used in that link table, then I had to use that as my ability to write information to the SQL Server database. I couldn't write using a pass-through query.
Can you run that one and see if you can update it, the record set?
Yeah.
Let's.
Yeah.
No, this one isn't. You're right.
Yeah,
I don't have a star.
Yeah. So if there's a secret that I'm not aware of, it's not too late to learn.
Yeah, the only way it worked for me was using a link table. I couldn't get the pass-through query to write.
I know. Like we're talking about a select versus an update or an action query.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Action queries execute on the server, so they can do the updates. But
yeah, I'm talking about the only way you can update is the table's linked, and not use the pass-through query.
Well, yeah, awesome. That's wonderful. You're talking earlier about using a trick of using the in clause. Colin recently, within the last couple of years, figured out how to update Excel worksheets using that technique. So maybe there's something we're not aware of.
George, I can certainly update remote records using the in statement for a table. So remote ODBC remote table in that way.
Thank you all for joining us today, and I hope you join us next month. Again, if you've got more suggestions for topics or you would like to present, please let me know.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Maria. That was very good.
Yep.
Very quickly.
Nice to see you guys.
Nice to meet you all.
Nice to meet you.